Hello folks, welcome back. This is our Seth Thomas office calendar number 2 that I did the big project creating the new base for that was missing in this clock, including veneering. Last we left this, I wasn't really sure of the condition of the calendar movement. So I've been running this clock for a while now, and I noticed that it had a couple exciting days. Going from June 29th, the clock jumped to the 1st, and then from there it jumped to July 7th on June 30th. So need to adjust some things there, and I think I have gone through that and solved the problem. And so I want to walk through how the mechanism works and how you might be able to adjust your Seth Thomas office calendar number 2. First of all, there are, I believe, a couple different versions of the movement. My version has these 2 rods. There are other versions that have 1 rod, and so obviously it's going to be somewhat different. But we'll start at the top and we'll see how this works. First thing to note in the back of the movement is this kidney bean shaped cam that is driven off of the time train here. There is a lever that is attached to the side of the case over here that has a bushing that rides on the lima bean there. Apologies for camera focus issues. And then there are these 2 rods that go through the lever, which is how these 2 rods are pulled. So as time advances, this cam is lifted and then the calendar advances. On the left side of this is the day of the week wheel. That's driven from this left rod here. This is a relatively simple arrangement. The drum has 2 weeks worth of days on it, so it goes once around, every 14 days. And there is a simple ratchet mechanism that just drives a tooth of this gear. The ratchet mechanism is difficult to see because it's on the back side of the plate that this lever drives. And then these 2 are the feet that hold the gear secure so that it only moves 1 day at a time. And so that's just very simple. Lift, ratchet grabs the tooth, drop, and then these 2 levers lock it to advance exactly 1 day. In this movement, the day of the week drum has nothing to do with the rest of the calendar movement. It is completely separate with this left lever. Very simple. Adjusting this to a different day of the week is as simple as just pulling up on this lever until the clock displays the day that you want. The right side is significantly more complicated. That's driven again with this rod. And if we follow the mechanical flow here, that connects to this plate here, which again, unfortunately, I can't show you without having the movement out of the clock. On the back of this is the ratchet pawl, which grabs one of these teeth here. And this is the date of the month wheel. So there are 31 of these teeth. In front of that is a snail cam, which lifts this lever here, which is part of the month-driven mechanism. And then on the front is another ratchet wheel that ensures that the calendar movement doesn't run backwards. On the month drum, there are some interesting add-ons that actually make this a pretty cool kind of calendar, and that is this is a perpetual calendar. What a perpetual calendar means is the clock knows the difference between a month like January, which has 31 days, and a month like February, which has 28 days. So this second lever, which is driven off of the main lifting cam, operates on this wheel as well as this cam disc on the drum, and it has 2 different mechanisms that it uses to index. You can see right in the middle the wide tooth that's riding on the ridge of the drum. That is either in a low position, or it rides up the cam into a higher position here, and then that causes this lever to remain elevated slightly. In front of that is a 4-toothed disc, which you can currently see 3 of the teeth. There's one here, one right here, and there's one over there, and there's a fourth tooth at the bottom of the wheel here. And this is the February wheel. So there are 2 different kinds of perpetual calendars. A basic perpetual calendar just knows the difference between a month that's supposed to be 31 days, 30 days, or 28 days. This is a full perpetual calendar movement that actually knows about leap year. And so the combination of this cam disc here as well as this February disc with the 4 teeth on it is how, in theory, if the clock is in good operation, as long as you keep it wound, you will never have to change the calendar. It will always be correct. So let's talk about how this works in a little more detail. If we advance our days, we see that the ratchet action, which is on the right side of this disc where the shaft connects, you can see the lobe of the ratchet lift up, and then right there it grabbed the next tooth, and then that advances the wheel. Simultaneously, you can see this lever rising, and then as I lower the movement, that stops the date wheel after advancing exactly 1 day. And so that's relatively straightforward, and we get towards the end of the month and we see that there's something kind of interesting that's going on here, and that is these teeth are shorter than the rest of them. And so this last tall tooth is the 28th tooth. The next tallest is the 29th. The next tallest, or the second shortest, is the 30th, and that shortest tooth is the 31st tooth. And so depending upon how many days the month has, and this lifting position, the combination of the cam disc on the month wheel as well as the February disc, that offsets this so that when we reach a month that has less than 31 days, you'll notice now that this lever doesn't go all the way down, and in fact, if I release the ratchet wheel here, we can actually clear that tooth. And so that's how the mechanism works. Now, a couple things to note as you're adjusting this. First of all, where this cam disc is red is at the top of the wheel here, but where the month is displayed is at the front. So if you end up changing paper on your calendar wheels, you need to make sure you figure out that the months need to be 90 degrees off of where it may seem like the cam lobes should go. Also, the February disc has 4 teeth, as I mentioned, and that is a similar method of operating. Those teeth stick up farther than the other cam disc because, again, we need to clear more teeth in our day wheel here. But also, one of these teeth is slightly shorter than the others, and that is the leap year tooth. And it's slightly shorter because we only want it to jump from the 29th to the 1st, not from the 28th to the 1st, like which happens normally. I'll advance the wheel so that you can see that tooth here. All right, I've advanced the clock so that now we can see all 4 teeth of the February wheel, and you can see this one has 2 marks on it, and that indicates that is the leap year tooth. So it's the year 2020 right now. That means that February of this year, that tooth should be placed in the top position. Otherwise, we might be right 3 out of 4 Februarys, but we may have a leap year in the wrong place. So that's the general operation of the movement. And as to adjusting it, the principal thing that you adjust are these 2 offset cams, which are what adjust the length of the linkages. And they are independent of each other. You can adjust the day of the week linkage separately from the date and the month linkage. And so I wanted, since I've just gone through this, to give a few pointers on how you actually adjust this and how you might troubleshoot what's wrong with the clock. The first step in adjusting the clock is knowing how high does the movement actually lift your lifting lever. And so if you look on the far side here, there is a slot which indicates the highest that the lever is allowed to move. So we know that's a hard stop up here. That's as high as the clock can possibly lift anything. But we want to make sure that we know where exactly that is so that we can have a reasonable reference to make sure that everything is correct. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually wind the clock ahead. We've got a ways to go. We're at 4 a.m. right now, but you'll be able to see the lima bean cam moving around. All right, there is 6 a.m. That's 6 a.m. is the lowest position of the lifting lever, and then it rises gradually during the course of the day. This is actually an ingenious method because it allows the clock to gradually build up quite a lot of energy so that it can move a lot of mechanical stuff without stalling. It takes 18 hours for the clock to store up the energy to fire the calendar. So we're getting there now. Now we're at 3 p.m. Our cam is still lifting, lever is lifting. Now we're at 6 p.m. There's 9 p.m. We're starting to get to the top of the travel of the lifting lever. And what's interesting, some clocks, I have another Seth Thomas, an office calendar number 6 that has a different movement in it. There's a sharp drop off. This clock does not have that. This clock has a graceful letdown. And one of the advantages of that is it's a little quieter. One of the disadvantages is you don't have any impulse drive. It's just simple gravity that pulls this down. And you may have noticed in my shot earlier, I actually added a couple magnets as a weight on the day of the week wheel because I found that made it a little bit more reliable. So here we are, almost at the very top of our wheel. And by the way, setting the hands up for this is how you find out when midnight is. You wind it around so the disc is at its highest point here, and then you put your hour hand at the 12, and that will determine when your clock actually changes day. If you are a night owl and for some reason you don't want your clock to change near midnight, you can adjust that. You can have it fire at 3 a.m. simply by moving your hour hand forward to 3 when the calendar mechanism is about to go. So there we go. And so I'm going to find the highest point of the lever. And if you're careful, this isn't a problem to run backwards or forwards. And so that is right about there. That is the highest point that this lever is. I'm going to change the camera angle and we're going to get some representation of where that is so that we know when we move this manually what our reference point is. Here is the lever. Again, we're at the highest point on our cam. This is screwed to the side of the case, so this end of the lever is fixed. And this end rides up and down in this slot. Now, you can see on my clock, it doesn't go quite all the way up. There's a little bit of extra travel there, which the movement does not use. And so when I'm manually setting this, I need to make sure that I'm raising the lever to this position rather than just banging it at the top of the bracket, because that will affect my linkage. Now that we've established our lifting reference, I'm going to go ahead and let the clock trip the calendar. So we're rolling around. There's 1 a.m. somewhere in there. And now you can see our lever is falling quickly. So there's 3 a.m. The hour hand's getting bumped as I'm being careless winding the clock. And so now at this point, we can start manually activating the clock to see what the effect is of the lever and if the linkages need adjustment. As I mentioned earlier, what I'm going to be doing from here on out is I'm going to be lifting this lever up to the position that I made a mental note of where the clock lifts to, and then we'll use that to set our next linkage adjustments. We'll start on the day of the week side since this is a simpler mechanism. This left lever is what activates the day of the week wheel, and the adjustment is performed by this eccentric cam. The cam has this large lobe at the top, and then right on the bottom of it you can see there is a tension washer that when you get it in the right place, you crank that washer, it's not a washer, that nut up against the main tension cam, and then in theory that locks it in place. I've stuck a couple magnets on mine. As I mentioned earlier, this clock doesn't have any kind of impulse where the mechanism falls off a cliff to use its energy all at once. It ends up being advanced pretty slowly, which means that I just found that I needed a little bit extra weight to make the drum roll. Not sure why that is, if something is worn. One thing is you are typically not supposed to oil calendar movements, and over time that oil can get gummy, and since the calendar actuates only once a day rather than thousands of times a day of the escapement of the clock, the lubrication really isn't necessary, and it ends up causing more trouble than it helps. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to raise the lever using the reference that I had earlier, and I'm going to watch the clock, and two things need to happen for this to be set correctly. The first is this needs to be lifted high enough so the ratchet wheel grabs the next tooth. It's difficult for me to show you this, but if we're quiet, we should be able to hear it. There it was. And then the second part is right here at the top of that bracket. That can't crash into this lever. If it crashes into this lever, that will create a power problem and might actually stop the clock. So we want to adjust this linkage so that it lifts high enough for the ratchet to advance the tooth, but not so high that it touches this pin on the locking lever. And there is a little bit of margin, so you can figure this out, but that's the general idea of how that needs to work. You will likely be spending about 90% of your time adjusting the other side of the calendar movement, because this is quite substantially more complicated than the day of the week side. So as I mentioned before, this right lever is how the power gets transferred from the movement down to the calendar. And again, we have our eccentric cam with a locking nut on the bottom. And so we're going to do our same thing. We're going to lift our lever at the top of the clock to the position that we've noted where the movement drives it to. And in a similar way, we need to make sure that this lifts enough so that the ratchet engages. In this case, it's actually possible to set it so high that you could advance 2 days on the date of the month wheel, and so that's not what we want. We want the lever to lift high enough so that our ratchet advances 1 tooth, and again, we'll listen for that. There it went. And it also needs to clear enough so that this lever clears the tooth. And you can see as we just hit our ratchet, there needs to be enough clearance for the wheel to advance before this attaches to the wheel. So we look for our ratchet tooth right there. And then we need enough clearance to make sure that the lever doesn't catch on the tooth before it advances. And there we go, and that looks pretty good. The next part is we need to deal with the perpetual calendar. There are 2 elements of that. There is the February wheel that has our 4 teeth here, and then there is the regular month cam, which is on the side of the drum here. The first thing that you want to do is to make sure that the paper of the month drum is actually in the right place. If the paper's been changed, it's entirely possible that it was put on the drum in the wrong orientation, and then you'll never get this right. So the challenge here is where the mechanism registers is 3 months off of where it's displayed. And so the easiest way to figure that out, which I'll show in a second here, is to set the drum paper to January with the lump at the end of the longest short piece. I'm going to zoom in and try to show that better. Because February is handled separately, then the period from December of 31 days, January of 31 days, and February of, in this case, effectively 31 days as far as the cam goes, into March, which is also 31 days, That is the easiest part to find on the wheel. And you can see here that we have this period going from December all the way around to August in the back, which is hard to see. That's where the largest flat spot in the drum goes, from August to January. January we have our bump, and then from then on the rest of the spring and summer months have their alignment that should be correct. So look for the biggest flat spot on the disc, align your paper so that that runs from August through the end of December right into January. Once you know that your month wheel is in the right place, again, you can just advance the movement going up to the reference point that you've made above, and just make sure that it is reliable, goes all the way around the month and works reliably. One thing to note, and this is the cause of most of the alignment issues, is the depth that this lever reaches when it's running. In a month of 31 days, this lever should go all the way down, and that means that when we get to the end of the month, we should stop at every day, including this shortest tooth. This is the 31st tooth, and so this month has 31 days. We need to stop at all of those days all the way through the 31st. And then we lift again, and now everything should move forward, and we saw our month advance. If this does not almost touch the bottom of the wheel, then you may need to adjust that a little bit and see how things go. The next adjustment that needs to happen is you need to make sure that the February wheel is actually corresponding with February, and that's driven off of the bottom of the drum here. And there is a little friction in this wheel here where, if you're careful, you can move that to the right place. And so you can see here is February, and I'm now up on my February lever. So that's what you want. When the paper shows February, you should be on one of the February teeth. And pay attention to which tooth that you're on, whether it is a 29th tooth, which is the leap year tooth, that's the one with the dots, or if it's a regular 28 month February, and that will then correspond to how this goes. In a 28 month or 28 day February, which is 3 out of the 4 years, you'll notice that the lever only barely clears the teeth. And the reason for that is at the end of this month, it needs to skip all the way from the 28th to the 1st. So once again, this is most of the adjustment of this movement, is making sure that this lever has the right depth, where on a 31-day month, it goes almost all the way down, and then on the 28th and the 29th days of February, it lowers to the right position so that the correct number of teeth can pass unobstructed. May take you a little bit of trial and error to make sure that that's functional, but that is the general gist of this. I would encourage you to take your time, make sure you get both dials off so that you can have comfortable access at it, and just cycle this thing through a whole bunch of times. Try to make sure that you're reproducing the action, both in terms of the height of the lifting lever as well as how quickly it's let down. You know, if I slam this, you know, all kinds of crazy things are going to happen, and that's not how the clock actually operates. We want to raise it to our point, a reference point, and then we want to let it down slowly, and that will be a normal position of the clock. Looks like I confused the wheel here. One other thing is, if you ever move this clock, you will find that there are some things that require gravity to be pointing down for this mechanism to work. These levers can be flipped up and kind of lost to the action, and that's going to be a problem. And so these need to be all the way down on both sides. Funny things can happen with the movement if cams get jostled or messed up. So it's good. You know, these clocks aren't meant to be moved. Get it where you want it. figure out a way to put a screw through the back of the clock into the wall, or use some other kind of mechanism so that you're not going to knock it off the wall, get it happy, and then enjoy it for a long time without messing with it. And it should be a reliable movement. Thanks for watching.